Thanks everybody for joining. It's a pleasure to have you here. My name is Nuno Couto. I'm one of the founders of the Meetup. We've been doing this since 2017 completely as a service to the community to help with networking and community building and knowledge sharing. There is no intention or content associated with sales. The group is the higher ed IT professionals, which you can find in Meetup if you do a search, or there's a link in the invitation. Our focus today, and this is, I think, the fourth of these AI
Fifth.
events. Is it the fifth, Tom? Fifth.
It's the
Okay.
fifth. Yeah.
Believe it or not, yeah, AI is a big deal these days, as everyone knows. And we thought that today we'd talk about what's going on outside of higher ed that can be applicable to higher ed in terms of use cases, in terms of lessons learned, in terms of transferable opportunities. We keep this very, very lighthearted and very informal. So if you have a question, if you feel compelled to share a story, don't hesitate. We're learning from you as much as maybe, hopefully, you learned a few things from others. Tom, do you want to go over the details of how we operate, and then we can
Yeah.
move over to introductions?
Not a problem. Hi there. My name is Tom Goldrick. I'm one of the co-organizers for this event. As Nuno mentioned, we've been doing this for a long time, and due to COVID, we switched to virtual, and this has been very successful for us. So, as you folks know, as Nuno mentioned, you're free to jump into the conversation at just about any time. We will have a sort of designated Q&A section towards the end of the conversation, but if the question or comment sparks interest, feel free to jump in. If you are a little bit more chat savvy, feel free to leave a comment in the chat and we will elevate that up to Nuno so that he can voice that question for you. You can also use the raise your hand feature in Zoom if you'd like to get our attention, and we'll try to bring the focus over to you. We also like to gather up materials, documents, or any other kind of notes that are shared during these calls and send them out to the group after. So if there's anything you'd like to share with the group, any questions you have for the panelists that you'd like to send to the rest of the group as well, feel free to send that to us or leave it in the chat, and I will add that as part of our care package after the call. We are also recording the call today, so this will be available online. And let's see, I don't think there's really much else to talk about in terms of logistics. If you have any questions or concerns, feel free to leave them in chat. And otherwise, Nuno, I think you can take it away.
All right, great. We also will likely share with EDUCAUSE, the CIO forum, the recording as well as the some of the shareable materials that we have, as well as anything that you want to share. So we're grateful for anything that you want to share with the community. So without further ado, let me introduce you, Carolina. Excuse me, I should know that by now. Rossini. She is at UMass Amherst. She is a lawyer, but also a researcher and faculty member at UMass Amherst. She has quite a background, and not only within higher ed, but also outside of higher ed. And then Pradeep Sanyal is the Chief AI Officer at the Data Institute at the University of San Francisco. He, of course, also brings quite a background in higher ed, but also outside of higher ed, including in consulting. So let's start with a question. Caroline, why don't we start with you, and feel free before you answer the question to provide any other details about your background. So what's been your experience, Carolina, about how other industries are actually putting AI to work and, applicability to higher ed?
Sure. Thank you so much. And please, everyone, you can connect with me in LinkedIn because I really want to use this time for a discussion first. But I am what's called at UMass a professor of practice. I was in the market for almost 25 years before joining UMass. And I sit between the public policy and the computer science school. And it's always awesome. My kind of theory of change purpose to come back to academia after doing a lot of advocacy, public interest advocacy, with a stint at at Meta, sorry, I quit after 2 years, is to really go back to the beginning of the value chain and bring public interest values to how we see technology, how we adopt technology, how we deploy technology, how we design technology. And this, I think, is a core issue today here in our discussion, right? So we were just talking before the meeting formally started that it's normal that in industries that are more highly regulated is where we're going to see a lot of things working or not working that we can use as actually inspirations for higher ed, especially if you are in a public institution, right? UMass is the kind of the flagship state university here in Massachusetts. So I'm also speaking from the point of view of a public university. I'm not speaking for UMass, but with that nature in mind. I also teach at Boston University in the law school, but again, I'm really focusing on the public interest side of things. So there is a bunch of research out there from Stanford, from MIT, from Mellon Ventures, and I'm happy to share some of the bibliography later for the CAR package that are pointing now to some, I think, trends, some patterns that we can learn from, right? But I also want to make sure to point that beyond those large institutional surveys, we have many and many case studies that you probably all have encountered around the harms of AI, around bias, around, right, lots of issues, right? So we can talk more about that in a later point, especially when we talk about governance and procurement for AI from a university standpoint. So I see that some of the case studies that are actually working out there are, for example, customer service and support automation, coding assistant, software engineer, right? We all know GitHub, Cursor, Cloud, so forth and so on. So you have a lot of success in that space. In healthcare, which is a highly regulated field, you have a lot of clinical documentation happening, right? And clinical document processing and information retrieval. And finally, in marketing, right? So I think there is a lot of good things happening and in terms of adoption for these activities that are more tedious, that might be more repetitive, that really help in terms of operations. However, we have not seen yet, at least based on these surveys, real scale in terms of, for example, autonomous decision making, especially in high stake contexts and markets, right? Which is something that can also be very dangerous if we don't think careful about governance in higher ed to try to use AI around decision making. Imagine, right, from admissions to grading to so forth and so on. There is actually a lot of business case in terms of, yes, there is money being saved at the use of AI at this operational level, but there is already a lot of money being lost in these spaces where decision making is implicated because of issues from privacy concerns to bias concerns to safety concerns, so forth and so on, right? So I'm going to stop here and let Pradeep and Nuno add, and happy to also bring more specific cases, right? As I said, highly regulated spaces such as healthcare and finance sectors are the ones that are giving us a lot of interesting use cases to keep an eye on.
Pradeep, what do you think? What are other industries doing that have relevance to higher ed and that have been especially successful from your experience?
So I think, Carolina, thanks so much. I think you gave a very good overview of what is happening in the industry. And the last 3 years, I think the space where the most adoption has happened is like financial services. They went the fastest. So fraud detection, document processing, wherever there's grunt work, there's a lot of paperwork. I think those were good case studies. Customer support, those were good use cases. Healthcare moved fast. Retail, logistics. I think the common thread is that every industry, they deployed the narrow, high frequency, data rich tasks, and they didn't start with broad transformation. So it was not about reinvention. It was specific workflows with clear inputs and measurable outputs. And I think some of the constraints, early constraints, were around data quality. Change management is still big because people are still figuring out what it means at different levels. And I think some of the things, like in terms of timeline expectations, they were like way off. Initially, the expectation was that within 6 months, within 12 months, you'll have the payback. I think that is something that whoever is investing, you need to be aware of, that it's going to take a while. Change management and figuring out where the data is, et cetera, et cetera. And lastly, the trust part. I think all of these are relevant for higher ed. One, looking at the whole opportunity as tiered. Low stakes automation start there, scheduling, transcription, document drafting. I think those are already, people are using it at scale. And I think the next step is making sure that, and also the context of agents. Everyone is talking about agents right now, and how agents will do a lot of the automation. That's It's too early, I think, for sectors like education, because there are a lot of unknowns right now. There's a lot of trust boundary questions which are still people are figuring out. So I think that's the backdrop, and all of whatever we have learned in the industry, the frameworks are directly applicable to the higher ed. The use cases would be different, but how we went about deploying it, I think there are a lot of learnings from there. Lastly, I would add the governance part. People are still getting there. I think there are a lot of regulations which are coming. States have different regulations, federal, there are different boundaries, etc., etc. So I think that's an evolving field. People have not figured that out completely, and that's also going to be a broad area. So yeah, I talked about a lot of things, but happy to uh, dig deep into any one of those.
Yeah, I'll mention also that in my experience, no matter what industry, the what I keep hearing, what I keep saying is people are concerned, people's professional identity is tied up in all of this. I certainly have seen it in higher ed, I've seen it in other places. It's not just about losing their job, it's about who they are, right? Who they are, what the future brings, lots and lots of ethical concerns, lots of concerns about security, lots of concerns about governance, etc. I certainly welcome folks adding in chat some of your experiences in this way. I do have a question to the audience and the panelists. If you've heard about this use case, this is pretty much a very, very bleeding edge use case for AI, but I think sooner or later it's going to have an impact on higher ed. Has anyone heard about the concept of a company or a department AI operating system and or a company AI brain or department AI brain?
I
Anyone?
heard of AI CEOs, but not that.
So it's
Well, I've been
something that
talking
a
about
lot
the
of
second brain, I think, like Karpathy, he came up with some way he's managing all the knowledge and all that. So I think that's an upcoming topic. People are trying to replicate that for themselves, for their teams, for their companies. Yes.
yeah. So it's a very interesting concept that especially organizations like the incubators and startup founders are promoting for their startups. And that is having a layer of AI. And Larissa, I see your comment. Yeah, it's kind of an AI brain, but it's more than it just being trained on a specific data set. It is trained on a data set, company information, everything from
Yeah.
meeting notes to emails to chats. It is at the intersection of a lot of communication channels. Plus, it has a lot of data about the company that is added to it. Plus, it's always on, right? It's not just a once and done thing. And what it does is it enables the queryable organization, meaning anyone in an organization at any point can query it, ask questions, and get answers. In addition, like for example, if you're in a project, it tracks the project, its activities. It can help with sprint planning. It can help identify risks. It can help to communicate and provide insights about where things are. It can help with strategy. I mean, imagine an organization an entity that has information about every single thing that's going on in the organization and can provide input into the strategy of a company. Have anyone heard
Yeah.
about this? It's pretty, I mean, it's a little scary because it has probably some impact to some of us as managers, especially middle managers.
Well, but that actually reminds me of the comment on agents, right? That Padre did, and I had a reaction to that, right? You see people, including in universities, starting to experiment with agents, right? From workflow issues to a friend of mine who was featuring the New York Times because she created all these agents and was able to recoup $5,000 in health insurance claims, so forth and so on, right? But I really fear that, for example, in the same sense of this AI brain, you give too much access, right? So I worked a lot on human rights issues and again, right, thinking about privacy by design, safety by design, especially in a university setting, you have trade secrets, right? You have some research that you need to have a certain processes so you can obtain patents later, right? You have FERPA restricted research, right? So you have all, and I really like the way you said, right? Let's think about stacks and also let's think about silos. When do we need silos and when we can break those silos, right? It's important to break silos, I think, in research. I have an open source background. I was like Creative Commons lead. If you guys heard about Creative Commons back in the early 2000s when I was still teaching like in Brazil, I'm all about breaking silos, but there are contexts that there is highly sensitive data, right? So I fear if you think about digital public infrastructures, right, like digital IDs and other things like that, I think those horizontal platforms are important, but you might still need some silos for sensitive and IP and things like that. And it's funny, this is not something that appeared at UMass, but it did appear at BU because of the high entry of students from China, for example, right? There was a lot of concerns about even like geopolitics, espionage. So it's I think that we wanna share and break silos to allow research, but I don't think universities might be ready for that type of approach or even agents. If you guys remember the news a couple of weeks ago, the head of security at Meta had an agent, gave too much access, lost all her email. And you guys working in, a lot of you have an IT background. She ran and disconnected, unplug her computer from the energy, the power, if that really makes a difference at this time, right? But anyway, so I'm gonna pause here.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you, Carolina. I want to go into the next question, but and thank you very much, John, for that reference to MoveWorks. I had not heard about that, but I went to their website just now. Very much what I was talking about. And Larissa, I see your message about PM notes. Absolutely. If you want to reach out separately, I work with a lot of PMs, and I am happy they share with you and with anybody prompts as well as some of the use cases I've seen with PMs. Very powerful. I think overall we're going from, and you all can react to this. We're going from a back and forth conversation with a chatbot to agentic relationship with a chatbot where you tell it what you want it to do and it goes off and does it. And in some cases, OpenClaw, although I don't recommend you use it at the enterprise because it's not secure enough, but with OpenClaw, it's a always on 24-hour a day agentic kind of structure. And then we're going to having an assistant, right? We're going to get an AI assistant that is customized to us, and then potentially an AI, very, very junior employee that assists the group to, a company-wide AI brain. I'm mentioning this and that progression because I really think that higher ed is slow to adopt these things, but sooner or later you're going to be hearing about it. And for you who are leaders and CIOs in the group, I think it's really important to keep in mind what's happening and what maybe your leadership is going to ask about in the future and what answers you're going to have. Feel free to react to that right in the chat or to raise your hand. So what lessons have other organizations outside of higher ed learned that would be applicable to higher ed? The biggest ones, let's say the top 2 or 3 lessons. Carolina?
Sure, and I think this connects well with what you just said, right? Wanting or not, at some point, somebody will adopt this, and the university might not have an exact policy about that, right? So I think, again, from the finance and health sector, you have those more operational adoptions that are indeed connected to a lot of governance. And the interesting thing is that because of the way they are big players, so they can negotiate enterprise forms contracts, right? They are not just users clicking through and accepting whatever terms of use. So I think that to remember that universities have some power to negotiate, I think is really important. But I think it's also important to think about what are actually the core AI governance issues and what those sectors are teaching us in that specific, right? Let's empower university to think we have the power to negotiate here. So the first issue, I think, is shadow AI, right? Universities have far more AI tools across campus than any IT department can be aware of, like faculty experiment, the staff adopts productive systems, right? We all have our own ways to adopt. And this discoverability is always a problem. And I'm not sure if that's going to be always, if it's going to always dealt with. But I think there is some lessons from finance, which is structure, right? Is structural. You really cannot prohibit the way people are using AI, right? So, but you can indeed meet with, for example, some sanctional alternatives, some clear policies, some lightweight pre-approval pathways, right? Even to guide faculty, to guide the students on what we as a community, right? Even if, like, imagine you have a social contract, sorry, the lawyer speaking, right? A social contract within your community on what we think it's okay, right? Because there are lots of metrics out there that can be used, but what are the metrics that our community can use? I think the other issue is accountability vacuum, and the pharmaceuticals industry can help us a lot. And you have a lot of literature saying how hard is, right, to determine the accountability point. Is it in the develop, like thinking about the AI life cycle, right? Is the data design aspect, right? At the very beginning of that data design and collection, the design of the model, right? The adoption, the deployment, the monitoring. We really need to figure out who are the actors there and think about what is the role of the university. The faculty has a deployer or has an adopter, right? So you're going to have universities and actors within universities playing different moments. And for example, if we have an enterprise contract with a provider, how much information we're going to ask from them, right? Are model cards enough? I don't think model cards are no longer, like, they are not enough, right? So you have some experiments around data sheets for data sets. You have a bunch of transparency requirements. If you look to the European Union, you do have some accountability tracking and even the idea of community consultation and involvement to determine accountability. Another one, I think, that we can learn from some work at the UK Department of Health. If you guys came across a think tank in the UK, I love them. It's called the Ada Lovelace Institute. So they have done a lot of research on pharmaceuticals and financial regulation. And they found that there is a mix around safety and innovation, right? And the university has lots of missions, right? We want to serve our community, but we also need to innovate, right? We are research enterprises, we are teaching enterprises, we are administrative enterprises, we are credential enterprises. So how we gonna make sense of all these missions that are conflicting through some form of governance body or multiple governance bodies, right? So I'm gonna pause here. So those are 3 ideas there to share with you.
Thank you, Carolina. And Pradeep.
A couple of points. I think Carolina, you covered a lot of ground there. I think the measurement is very important, like what is working. So tying everything that you're doing to certain objectives. I mean, if you just say that AI for AI's sake, it's not going to go anywhere. So having those objectives, what are you trying to achieve? And then defining those matrices upfront and measuring it through the journey. Now, a lot of these measures you would not be able to see immediately. They come like after the implementation, post-implementation. So also defining some of the leading indicators, I think that is very helpful. Am I on the right track? So I think that is something that I learned through the long cycle implementation programs, where these were like 12 months programs. And so to give you an example, like you're saying a chatbot or a customer support, how often are the operators using it? How long are they using it? Are they rating those? If there's an expectation that you rate that, are they rating those? Are they returning to those workflows? So these are leading indicators which will tell you that eventually this is in the right direction. So that's one broad area in terms of the measurement. And I think it's also the community involvement is, I think, a lot more in the higher ed, because it cannot be just top down. It has to be across faculty, staff, student, and people have to see the value. I mean, what is in it for me? I mean, you talked about the identity question. I think it becomes so much more here, because a lot of the work in higher ed is about intellectual showing up as experts, or and that question, I think, has to be addressed across. So and it doesn't happen automatically. You have to make a conscious effort to do that. So there are some frameworks in the industry, ProSci, ADKAR, where there's an awareness phase, and then there is the whole, I think, the desire look. So at an individual level, there has to be a compelling reason for me to say that, yes, I know what you guys are trying to do, but this is why, what it means for me. I think that part oftentimes is missed. So yeah, those are 2 points I wanted to add.
I agree with you, and I also have seen most organizations think about a very transactional, hey, let's implement this AI tool, and enable this particular very, very limited use case. They're not thinking about the use cases that are going to have the greatest impact on profitability and ROI. And I know that higher ed typically doesn't talk a lot about that, but higher ed has costs, right? So the question is not just how can we automate meeting notes, although that's a very common use case. It should be what drives costs and profitability in our department, and how can we enable that function with the assistance of AI? I think that's a little bit of a different question. It's a much bigger question. And also that you need to continuously measure. It's not a once and done. There's measurements that need to be taken over time so that you see what does work and what doesn't work. Yeah, faculty won't like that for sure, for sure. One last question, and then we can start having some more audience questions and feedback. Carolina, you showed a little bit some passion around a particular topic, and that was AI procurement, the procurement of tools. And you've had some experience with that. Can you share some of your insights?
Sure. And again, I'm so sorry for putting my lawyer hat right now, right? But also just to say that I work with a group that was one of the first international scholars group on AI called KaiDP, and I'm gonna share with you the link for that. Everybody is welcome to join. We host students every semester in a clinical, and why I'm bringing them, it's because we actually work a lot on procurement and even responding to public consultations on procurements and things like that. Because again, I think that's where actors such as universities and the public sector, right, can exercise power. I get really amazed by how quickly some actors, especially public government actor, public sector actors, are adopting AI without really thinking about the governance, without really discussing the power of purchase, and that creates lots of risks, such as vendor lock-in, right? You guys probably came across Google giving a lot of free stuff from courses to infrastructure here in Massachusetts. And if you heard about a company called Telefonica, right, is a large telecommunications company in Europe and Brazil. I was their in-house counsel back in the late 90s, and we did a lot of digital literacy programs by giving computers out, right? But then you do vendor locking, right? So let's make sure that we understand some of the dynamics here and really stop and think about the procurement. So As I said, going specifically on some procurement things to think, and happy to have separate conversations, is like, I think is really the most consequential governance lever that a university control. And I'm not really just saying that because I'm a lawyer. I really think, again, that's where we can enforce our institutional values through contractual obligations, right? Through the guardrails of a procurement. So I think there are a couple of things we should think when thinking about procurement. Think about your data flow in both directions, right? What data the vendor gets from us, universities, is student work, research data, and communication going to be used to train models, right? Is data segregated by tenant, meaning those silos we talked about, right? Does the contract coming out of the procurement permit secondary use, model improvement, sharing by third parties? Right? How we deal with ADA things like accessibility things, FERPA things, HIPAA things, so far and so on, right? So I think the contract, the guardrails of the procurement should really be dealing with that. The second, I think, is what we call evidence, right? Evidence before purchase, not after. How are those models behaving? What is the status of accuracy, bias, accessibility, right? So Educause created a very interesting work around procurement in 2025. They have put together this framework called Higher Education Community Vendor Assessment Toolkit, and I think it's really in a good direction there to help us through that process. Audit and exit rights, right? So can us as universities audit as the system is performing once it's deployed? Who can be part of that audit, right? In terms of even students, right? You can even use some of those moments as experiential learning opportunities. And of course, like fourth is accountability and liability, because if somebody's hurt in your community, the university is the contact point, right? So how you're gonna deal with the liability? And I think that, again, is structural. I think procurement should not come, or just the Purchase Act should not happen before all these governance questions are really answered. So I think the fix is not to put procurement under governance. Any AI tool purchase above a threshold should go through a very defined review that includes IT, privacy, legal, accessibility, and academic stakeholders. It is complex. Yes, it is very complex. Does this apply to everything? Maybe not. It depends on, right, which layer of that AI system will plug in, right? But again, I think it's very important. Nuno, you also had mentioned something around open source, right, at one point in our discussions. A lot of times open source helps, but not really, right? Because I think you have some transparency there, some accountability there. Maybe you have more control over the models. But to tell you the truth, a lot of the frontier models are no longer open source. And if you do have open source, you then have to plug into a lot of staff training and community training, which is great because then you use open source as a way to develop staff capacity, but then you also have to have compute infrastructure. Not every university has compute infrastructure, right? You have to have security expertise, not every so open source helps, but it might not be an answer, again, depending on where you are plugging that AI in your infrastructure.
Thank you, Carolina. Any reactions or additional thoughts, Pradeep, or anyone else on the call?
I think since we talked about procurement, one thing that I want to also highlight is like the trend commercial models to open source. I think the quality of the models are getting very good, the open source ones. And what you have, like the Gemma 4 ones, they're probably as good as what it was 12 months back as the frontier model. And since we are talking about procurement cycle, etc., I think there's another angle to that as to how much of a dependency you want on external, vendors versus building something in-house. And for specific use case, specific and agents are going to happen. So small language models. So on the tech side, some of those are also going to be relevant. And it's happening in the industry. So I think that's also one area to keep a watch on. What is trending? How easy is it to deploy it locally in your own data center? And since there is so much of trust boundary questions and security it's going to be quite messy with some of these promising models and mythos and all that. So I think that's one broad area which also should be in considerations when you're talking about deployment.
Pradeep, you made me think of something that I feel coming from the global south, right? As I mentioned, I'm from Brazil originally, so I always thinking about how things affect the global majority and also vulnerable populations. And it's very interesting that open source is actually being used. There is a whole movement around digital sovereignty, right? Both at the national level, but also at certain communities. So in the US, you have all the communities of Native Americans, right? In Brazil, we call them original populations. So perhaps you have a certain university that serves specifically that type of community, right? And maybe open source is a way to go because, for example, if you're working with indigenous people, and here I'm using the term broadly, they have principles around their data use, right? Which are the care principles that are already plugged in within NSF, research grants, NIH, and a lot of other data sets around indigenous data. So I love that what you said, that indeed in some specific context that just doesn't help with skills, but might protect and empower local communities and vulnerable communities.
Thank you both, Carolina and Pradeep, for your insights so far. So how about I just pose a question to the audience? What do you feel? What's the biggest barrier you're finding in your organization in terms of moving AI forward? What are the biggest challenges you're facing?
I would be curious to hear the answer to Carolina's question as well. Do you or universities or colleges have sandboxes set up? I think that's an interesting one.
Would you like to expand on that?
So I'm the data governance analyst at Berklee College of Music in Boston, and we are using Google, and I haven't used it much. I'm using Claude, not as a paid user, for a lot of the things that I need, like help with documents and policies. But I can foresee, like I said earlier, management's asking for how can we use AI in analytics? How can we use AI in decision making? And I can tell that we're going to have issues with our data quality. We have two student systems and we're moving to Workday. So the two student systems track data differently, and trying to combine them into one for Workday is already a problem. Trying to feed that into a data lakehouse is a problem. Trying to reconcile and validate data is a problem. And the fact that we have multiple learning environments without consistent standards is an issue. And then we have an AI working group that consists of very high level C-suite people, but there's no down below staff members kind of feeding information or what would be helpful. And I think I hear this from a lot of schools, that AI is really focused on faculty and students and not what staff would need. And so it's about, how are we going to implement AI in the classroom? And how are we going to teach students when this is so new and we don't really know what their environment is going to need? And in the meantime, all of our platforms are rolling out AI features, and there's no way to evaluate which ones we're going to use and what like Carolina was saying, what the vendor might be requiring, and how does that align with the issues or the policies that we have on campus. And there's no central place that's evaluating this, as far as I know. So, and I'm keep raising my data governance hand and saying, I'd like to work with you, but no one's answering. So those are some of the frustrations that I personally, this is like a help session or a therapy session.
I don't know if you noticed, Larissa, I put lots of hearts for you because I really feel your pain. Before joining UMass, and I still am, I'm part of the board. It's a think tank called the Data Sphere Institute, and it's all about data governance. And like 10 years ago, I was saying, it's not just about AI, it's about the data, it's about the data, it's about the data, right? And now we are at this really, how do you say, like this crossroads, right, of a problem, and it's an expensive problem. So I think there are two options, right? You have to maybe even do a break. Do you want to reform or do you want to transform, right? There are all these options, right? So can we put a break And again, I'm not an IT person, right? You guys can correct me, but like, what do we do about the past, but that now how we fix things for the future, because it might take a while to talk about the past. Funny enough, my husband is also a big data guy. He was the head of platforms for the Broad Institute, head of clinical trial for Biogen. And I remember when he was before that doing some pro bono work on COVID for NIH, and it was the same issue, right? There was no interoperability at all around data sets coming from states. So I think that's some of the things, right? How you need to get talking about the kind of let's help each other. You need to find your own, I think, heroes at the leadership level and make them understand that data governance is the core for the success in the long run. Doesn't matter if it's for staff or faculty or students. I'm happy to talk about practices and advocacy strategies on that. But I feel you, and I really admire your work.
Yeah, as far as data, I mean, imagine putting in junk data into a company brain or a department brain. I mean, talk about a recipe for failure. I've been working with one university for probably close to 20 years, and one of the things they have been trying to implement is data governance, and they have failed 3 or 4 times. It's just a very complex effort, and one of the biggest issues has been the business side, not seeing the value. I don't know if you've seen that too, Larissa.
Absolutely. And I don't know how to remedy that. I think it's amazing. You know, lots of schools have had layoffs and we had one too. And one of them was our data integrity analyst as we are doing data conversion. And it I just wanted to raise my hand in a very large meeting and say, all of you who are making decisions, how do you expect to make quality decisions on bad data? It's very frustrating that there's not a lot of resources. And I see this, you know, I'm in the EDUCAUSE data governance group. I hear this from them a lot. I hear it in other places. And I keep wondering how like I came from banking and that was before there was a big data governance push, but I often wonder how can you bring the structure of an organization like finance to higher education, which is so, you know, decisions by consensus and each department gets to do what they want. And it's very difficult not to have those more hierarchical structured things in place.
And I think those are the limitations of the examples we brought, right, from finance and healthcare. But one of the things that like now we have a deadline, and I'm not sure to whom this deadline apply, right, for accessibility implementation, right? I think our deadline was this year and now is early next year.
Next
It's a
year.
yeah, it's a mandate, right? And hopefully like the federal government doesn't hear that we are still doing accessibility issues. But anyway, that's another conversation. And again, right, being an institutionalist, for me, things just work when there is mandates and money, right? So if there is going to be a mandate to do that, to help universities, especially public ones, then the federal government or the state government has also to help with funding. Otherwise, we will all get locked into providers like Google, and then it's surveillance capitalism for you, right? But maybe that's okay. But are we making conscious choices that, sure, Google is going to help me and pay for me to do all of that, but we are giving all the data of everything we do to Google, right? It's trade-offs there.
As far as governance, there's obviously data governance, and then there's also AI governance, right? And I was at a recent event where the panelists talked about what percentage of universities have AI governance, and it was something like only about 20% or so. Like about 20%, 20 to 30%, I think, had some version of AI governance. Another 20 or 30% were working on it, and then the rest hadn't even thought about it. So it's more than data. It's AI as well. Does anyone have any other questions or thoughts or insights to share?
I'm just curious and wanted to ask, like, where are your AI initiatives? At what stage are they in? Is it pilots or is it deployed? Just to get a sense, I mean, is there a trend or is it like each one to their own?
I mean, I'll speak for Berkeley. We just launched Google in the spring for faculty and students and staff. And we'd had a pilot for roughly 3 to 4 months.
Okay.
And we're still piloting Zoom AI for note taking. I think there's some questions about how widely we can deploy it based on sensitive information and the fact that people will maybe log in without into external meetings without thinking about what's turned on or off.
I did an assessment, Larissa, not too long ago on Zoom, Teams, a tool called Cogram for project managers and meeting notes, and then there's the general chatbot. If you want to reach out separately, I can give you more information on those results.
It might be helpful.
Yeah, of course, anytime. So I think we're approaching 1 o'clock. A very
Yep.
sincere thank you to the panelists as well as to the participants.